Remember that reading list I set out at the beginning of spooky season? Well, I didn't really stick to it. Hi, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm talking about all of the books I read in October. Let's start off strong with a book I have already gushed about, Silvercloak by L.K. Stephen. I already made a whole separate video about this book, so if you want to hear more about it, go and watch that video. It's a good one, but I'll summarise it here for you because I'm just nice like that. Silvercloak is a dark fantasy all about this girl, Saffron, who's an undercover detective, and she has to go undercover in this sort of magic mafia kind of organization that is responsible for the death of her parents. This is a bit of a fraught mission where she has to pretend to be one of the bad guys in order to infiltrate them, and it sort of puts her morals to the test. Especially since going into this mission, she has just seen this prophecy which shows her kissing and then killing the kind of prince of this underground organization. So from the outset, we know it's probably going to be kind of fantasy romance, but with an interesting twist. And actually, unlike a lot of fantasy romance books where the fantasy world building is kind of weak, this one has really strong, really interesting world building. The entire magic system is based off of pain and pleasure, and pain and pleasure kind of are used to replenish or strengthen your magic. All of the magic is casted with wands, a very Harry Potter style, but it is an adult book and there is sexual scenes and things like that in here, but nothing like too over the top. It was very tasteful and well done. And I just couldn't say enough good things about it. Please go read it. I watched the author's Instagram story earlier today, and she was talking about other books of hers that were very successful versus some that weren't so successful, and just her kind of opinion on that. And she was talking about how Silvercloak maybe wasn't as big as she hoped it would be, but she wasn't letting it get her down. Like, she's got multiple books coming out in this series, and she also has YA books that have done very well. And even though it was a very inspirational and light-hearted kind of video, I did make me sad because I was like, Silvercloak is so good and it really does deserve to get better sales, maybe. And I don't think it's got bad sales at all, but it deserves like to be the next big thing, in my opinion. So go out and read it. This isn't sponsored. Just go out and read it and make it the next best thing, because she seems like such a nice person, such a cool author, and the story is really cool. So I just want more people to enjoy it like I have. After Silvercloak, I went on to read Nod. This is one of the only books that was actually in my list of things I'm going to read this spooky season. Nod is sort of a post apocalyptic tale about this weird event where most of the world's population suddenly becomes unable to sleep. Our main character, Paul, who's a writer, is one of the people who can actually sleep, so we get to see the world kind of disintegrating before his eyes, including his wife, Tanya's, who is one of the unfortunate people who cannot sleep. This edition has a really interesting essay at the end by the author who, after writing this book, was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and he sort of went through his own almost descent into madness, kind of like in this book, as a result of going through all of his cancer treatment. And he did eventually pass away from that brain tumor. And so this book had a lot more poignant moments in it because of that knowledge of the author and what he went through shortly after writing this. I think this might have been the only book he ever wrote, which is quite tragic. Some of the lines in this book were really well written, really beautifully written. I really liked, there was a passage in the beginning where he talks about how going to sleep every night is just like dying every day, and we kind of seek sleep without any fear, even though there's no guarantee that we're ever going to wake up. And that was an interesting thought. It kind of made me think quite a lot about fears of death, and maybe facing that death with the same kind of attitude that you face going to sleep, because you really never know what's going to happen from day to day or whenever you go to sleep. And I think the fact that he had passed away shortly after writing this just made me think about what he'd written in a whole new light. All of that aside, though, I did have a few issues with this book, namely, like, the main character, Paul, I didn't find very likable. He kind of talked about his wife in a sexual way. There were some, like, explicit scenes with the wife between him and some other people, other characters in the book, that was really disturbing. And like, obviously the book's meant to be disturbing, but I really didn't like that this only like female character in the book was treated the way that she was. Made me a little bit uncomfortable, and I think she could have been a better written, more well-rounded character. However, I think part of the issue is just that from day one in the book, like, she's not sleeping and she's starting to deteriorate quite quickly. So obviously we don't see her like at her best. But I think there could have been more allusions to her character before, and about the relationship, to make it a bit more heartwarming. But instead, even aspects of their relationship was a bit disturbing to me. And I think for me, some of the impact of the story was lost because I didn't connect to her or Paula's characters. I also thought the plot was just okay. I thought going into the story that I would be a lot more gripped and a lot more interested, but it was a bit of a struggle to get through after maybe the first third. Like, I was a little bit fed up with it at that point. Maybe because I just finished Silvercloak and had such a good time with that book. And this is obviously a bit more of a literary style. It's, it is different, and maybe it's just not what I was in the mood for. But I don't think I would reread it. I think it was okay. I would give it like 3 stars. But there was things I appreciated about it, and I thought the idea and the concept overall was really fascinating. This idea of an insomnia apocalypse. After that, I went on to read Scuttlers Cove by David Barnett. This was amazing. I gave this 5 stars. This is a folk horror, and it's one of the first folk horror novels I've ever read. I've actually went out and bought quite a few more since reading this, including his first book in this series. The books aren't connected, but there's like a vague connection at the end, which I didn't really get, but you didn't have to get it, to be honest. Like, you didn't have to read book one. But I have book one, I'm going to read it. And there's a third book coming out in March 26th, which is called Scratch Moss. And Scratch Moss is also referenced in this book at the ending. The first one's called Withered Hill, and they basically say, Withered Hill and Scratch Moss is a similar place that has similar folk horror stuff going on. I don't think that's a spoiler to say, because that's the whole premise of the book. Scuttlers Cove is set in Cornwall, which is automatically interesting to me because I live in Devon, right next door to Cornwall. Have been to Cornwall a lot, and I'm kind of enmeshed in the culture down here in the southwest. It's about this girl, Merrin, whose mother has just died. She's been living in London for the past 10 years, and she returns to Scuttlers Cove to kind of sort out her house, do all the things you have to do after your loved one dies. And she gets there and she realizes she's forgotten quite a lot of her life growing up in Scuttlers Cove. It's almost like she's been under a spell to forget about Scuttlers Cove, and like, she doesn't know why she never came back after leaving 10 years ago. She reconnects with this kind of old flame from school, and she starts getting enmeshed in all of these local customs again, and decides she's going to stay living in Scuttlers Cove. The story is like multiple POVs, so we get her POV, and also this man that she reconnects with, and also this other character who is just bought one of the rich houses up on this hill called Nans Avalon, where there's this apple tree. It all sounds like a fever dream to explain, but it will make sense in a minute. She's basically just lost her husband, who was very rich, and so she's inherited a lot of money. And she's hanging out with all of his rich friends, and they've all bought these houses that were a new development on this kind of old ancient land. And the whole crux of the conflict of Scuttlers Cove is that there are all these locals with their local traditions and folklore, and then you have all of these rich people from London with their second homes. They come in the summer and they bring in a lot of money, but they are basically pricing the locals out of the market of their local home, and that's leading to a lot of animosity. This is a huge real problem for people in Cornwall. If you try to go to Cornwall in the off season when it's not summer, it's hard to even find a pub or a corner shop that's open, because like, some villages are just like all second homes, and they just don't really survive very well in the winter. I've learned that by going a walk in Cornwall in the winter and just wanting to like buy a bottle of water in a shop, or thinking, okay, we'll go there and then there'll be a pub and we can have a drink and then walk back. And you get there and there's nothing, and you can't go to the toilet, and you can't get a bottle of water, and it's a bit of a problem. And it's really sad because these are beautiful locations, beautiful areas, but the culture is just dying, and all the homes are lovely, but they're all millions and millions of pounds. So it is actually a big problem of pricing out the locals. So this book takes that concept and makes it into a folk horror, because up where these new build houses where these rich folk are living, it's this place called Nance Avalon with this apple tree. There's basically this old god living under the apple tree that is not happy with all of this stuff going on. And from dual POVs, from locals and from our two like female main characters, we start to see this mystery unraveling, and it's got all of the tropes that you would expect for a folk horror, such as rituals, old gods, old versus new. I don't want to get into too many specifics because I don't want to spoil it for anyone, because like you go into it to unravel a mystery for yourself. But it was a really cool story, and I just totally flew through it in like 3 or 4 days. So if you want a good folk horror recommendation, pick this one up. Moving on to the next one. Around actual Halloween time, I read What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher, the first T. Kingfisher novel I've read, and this was another 5-star from me. I loved this. I also read it at a really cool event. It was a silent book club where everyone just meets up and reads in silence, but it was set in this old priory, this Tudor building, and there was seats in all of the different rooms. So I went to this kitchen which had the highest ceilings ever. It was like 3 floors high, and there was a smoke machine, there was lanterns, it was all old stone walls, and all of the old like copper pots and pans were hanging around, old pottery, things like that. It was very atmospheric, and there was also very nice cupcakes and hot spiced apple. Such a lovely festive event that I hope they do again next year. And so, because this book was nice and short, I decided to take this along, start it on the day, and I pretty much finished it in one day. I read half of it during the event, and then like the other half when I got home or like the next morning. So, devoured this really quickly. What Moves the Dead is basically a retelling of The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. My only experience of The Fall of the House of Usher is the Mike Flanagan Netflix series of it, which is kind of mixed with The Raven. So I was a little bit unfamiliar with like the normal real story. So basically, in this one, we have the two ushers, Madeline and Roderick, and their old friend comes to visit them because it seems Madeline is very, very sick. This old friend, this main character that we follow, is Alex Easton, and Alex is a female but kind of non binary, and they go by different pronouns. Alex basically comes from this kind of fictional country in Europe and was part of the army there. And in this country, they kind of have non binary pronouns for children, and they also have separate non binary pronouns for soldiers. So a lot of women will join the military and then become non binary and go by this other neo pronoun. It wasn't the same kind of concept of non binary as we have in the culture today. It was just a fantasy version of this whole other culture that has this just different set of customs around pronouns, and just using separate pronouns for people specifically in the military, which I thought was interesting. And Alex was a really fascinating character. They had a really good connection with animals, including like their horse, and they were quite brave and unflappable. They weren't very superstitious or anything like that, or easily scared, but yet they still get creeped out by the events of this book because it's otherworldly, but still try to rationalize and not leap to the conclusion that it's ghosts or anything like that. So they had quite an interesting perspective on everything that was going on. And they also talk a little bit about the brutality of the war and bravery involved in the war, and how that's different from the bravery involved in like facing these spooky events. Now, the spooky event in question is that there seems to be some sort of fungi mushroom problem in the House of Usher. There is a nightmare of fungal growths, possessed wildlife, all surrounding a dark, pulsing lake at the house. Madeline sleepwalks and speaks in strange voices at night, and her brother Roderick is consumed by a mysterious malady of the nerves. So Alex goes to just try to discover what is going on with the ushers and try to help them. And I'm sure you can guess from the description and from the artwork that mushrooms and fungi have a lot to do with what is wrong with the ushers. I thought this sounded really cool because I'm really into The Last of Us, the video game, which is all about cordyceps and how they take control of bodies and create these kind of zombie characters. The fungi in this story was a little bit different, maybe a little bit more realistic and less violent. But I wouldn't say any more because I don't want to get into spoiler territory. But I thought the way it was done was very cool, very interesting, and also very spooky and unnerving. And I would thoroughly recommend it. I think I'll definitely pick up another Tea Kingfisher for next Halloween. And finally, the reason why I didn't get through any more of my reading list is because I read read this monstrosity, Alchemised, which is 1,000 pages and very deadly. I'm going to be honest, had no plans on reading this, but then there was lots of hype, and I'd never read Manacled, and I thought, you know what, I might have liked Manacled, and now I can't read it, and now this has been reworked. Maybe I should give it a chance because it's been, totally separated from the IP, and Senlin Yu has built this whole new world around it. And you know what? I thought I'm going to give it a chance. And I'm glad I did. Overall, I enjoyed the book. It was very dark, obviously. So saying I enjoyed it seems a bit weird when it's so like harrowing and dark in places. But I did because I'm a sick bitch. But I guess maybe that's where my taste is and where a lot of people's taste is because this book has sold like millions of copies already and millions of people read Manacled. So I guess I'm not as unusual as I think I am. Overall, I think this was adapted from the fanfiction very well. Obviously, I haven't read the fanfiction and I'm not generally a fanfiction reader anyway. So that opinion is a little bit like, okay, you know nothing. But if you hadn't told me it was a fan fiction, I probably wouldn't have been able to guess that, apart from the fact that it's very long. I think the book's length made sense given that it's kind of trying to wear you down as if you've been to war and you've been through all of these terrible things and almost kind of traumatize you into buying into the love story as well. And it's effective in that sense. It kind of feels like you're going mad while you're reading it. However, I think the book could have been improved by being cut down by at least a couple hundred pages, especially that big part two, that middle section, which I think was 600 or 700 pages out of the 1,000 pages. I found myself really enjoying and being really intrigued by part one, which is the darkest part of this book, arguably, where Helena is a prisoner and she doesn't have her memories and she doesn't know what's going on and everything's just horrible. Part two kind of goes back into those recovered memories, so we go back and start to get fresh perspective on things. This kind of had me flicking back to the start of the book because at the start of the book you bump into people like Grace and Penny, and you're like, I don't know who these bitches are, so I don't really care. But then you meet them later on, and you're like, oh yeah, that was that person there. So I did have to scroll back and see, okay, yes, that's them. So I have an idea of what's going on. And then part three takes us back into the present, which I liked because by that point I really wanted the resolution that, never happened from part one. Overall, I think those time jumps worked, but it was just the pacing of them and the second part being too long as opposed to the shorter part one and part three that I had a bit of a problem with. Another slight problem I had that was just always going to be a problem when you know that it's Harry Potter and Manacled is that I'd spent a lot of the book, especially in the beginning, figuring out who was who. So, like, obviously, Helena and Kane are Hermione and Draco. But I was like, okay, look, so Luke's Harry and Lila is Ginny and Soren is Ron. So, oh my god, Soren, Ron, kind of similar, huh? And I was like, oh, is Shiso like Snape, maybe? Obviously, the big bad guy is Voldemort. I couldn't figure out who like Crowther was meant to be or who Ilva was meant to be. Obviously, there was like the Weasley parents, where Lila and Soren's parents. Couldn't figure out who Penny was meant to be. Maybe like Luna Lovegood or something. I don't know. But I spent a lot of the time kind of going, okay, this institute, this is Hogwarts, and just making these comparisons, which is a bit of a shame, but like was just always going to happen. I do think most of the characters, aside from like obviously the main two, were different enough from their Harry Potter counterparts, but they were a little bit lacking in comparison to the Harry Potter characters. Like Luke, Lila, Thorin, they could have had interesting aspects about them, but we don't spend as much time with them in the book because they're off fighting and Helen is in hospital. So you almost get less time with them. And I think for Manacled, you're relying on your knowledge of their historical relationship from like the Harry Potter books. And so I was just kind of assuming that Helena's relationship with them was very similar to the relationship Hermione has with the others in the Harry Potter books. And relying on that, whereas these characters in this kind of world is really quite different and darker from Harry Potter. So I'm not sure if those assumptions were really met. For example, I felt like the Order of the Eternal Flame in this book treated Helena really poorly. She was kind of like this immigrant brought over to like fulfill a quota and then shamed for her magic and things like this, which I don't see the Order of the Phoenix doing to Hermione purely because of her blood status, because they were explicitly not prejudiced to Muggleborns. So I found myself at times going, they wouldn't treat Hermione this way. But I think over time with this book, especially into part two, I was able to eventually separate it from Harry Potter and look at it in its own right. And I did think that the Order of the Eternal Flame being slightly more morally grey than the Harry Potter counterpart was a good decision. I thought it added a bit more complexity to like the good versus evil story because the good side had its flaws as well. And I liked this whole idea of necromancy versus alchemists. I thought it was interesting and it was an interesting magic system. I thought it was really cool and dark, this concept of the undying and that they could take people's souls and put them into different corpses and force them to live in a rotting corpse. That was really dark and very interesting. And I liked that a lot of the book had commentary on war and the cost of war and Helena's perspective on the war as a healer. You know, even battles where her side of the war was winning, she only ever saw the cost, and like that had quite a mental toll on her. I thought that was a super interesting perspective. And then the romance was interesting. I didn't fully buy into it because I don't think I really ship Draco and Hermione just based on who they are as people. It's not really my thing. But I thought Helena and Kane's love story was interesting. It was very murky and morally grey. Didn't like the part when he kept beating her up or the other violence shown to her, but I kind of got how he could justify it and she could also justify it in hindsight. I thought the darker and more toxic aspects of the relationship wasn't necessarily fetishized. I thought it was like handled with a fair amount of care compared to a lot of romantasy where, you know, the male is very possessive and very toxic and it's like, oh, that's just sexy, that's just hot. I really got that even though there was sexual chemistry in this book, it felt like Helena and Kane's feelings and, you know, feelings of sexual chemistry grew quite naturally and as a result of some shared trauma. So it didn't feel like it was there to just be a fetish, which I appreciated because I like when sexual or smutty scenes even like actually fit the story and like serve an actual purpose rather than just like titillating the reader. And this romance overall fit the broader themes and mirrored the broader themes of the novel really well. So overall, it was a thumbs up from me, but I'm not giving it like 6 stars or anything over the top. I liked it, it was good. I think I'll think about it for a long time and I might even reread parts of it, but I'm not sure if I'll ever sit down and read the whole thing again because I don't want to sit through the repetitive aspects of the middle again. So there we have it. That is everything I read in October. I did start another book. I was reading it like during the Halloween period, Home Before Dark. Was hoping to finish it for this video, but I've been too poorly to read, to be honest. So you have to wait until December to see my video on that one, and everything else I end up reading in November. I'm planning on doing like Secret History and We Love You Bunny, the Bunny sequel. And then we'll see if I've got time for any more spooky books at the end of November. But if not, then I'll be heading into Christmas. Let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought, and what you thought of Alchemised. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, please. I put out new videos every Tuesday. Might miss a few in the run up to Christmas because I am super burnt out. And I'm currently filming this at 10 o'clock at night because desperate times call for desperate measures. So please subscribe and join my little book club with me. Thank you for watching. Bye!